This is Bruton Parish Church. It's one of the oldest churches in America in continuous use. All good stories start with once upon a time. So, once upon a time, a pope decided to divide the world in half. He drew a line down the map and he said, everything on this side goes to Portugal, everything on this side goes to Spain. Nobody else got a vote. Not everybody took that as well as he would have hoped. Just a few years later, the English are still trying to get out on the water to figure out what's in the rest of the world. Of course, fishing fleets had been everywhere, so people had an idea there was a lot more than just their little island. But very shortly, people began exploring.
As early as 1497, John Cabot is sailing for England, but he is coming across to what we would lovingly call the New World. A few years later, in 1517, a very interesting, intelligent, perhaps controversial and charismatic young Catholic monk by the name of Martin Luther decides he's had enough
of the excesses of Rome and the indulgences and the money and all of what he considered false teachings. So he writes his 95 Theses.
He hammers them on the door of the church in Wittenberg, Germany.
And every hammer blow echoed over Europe. And just like the waves of the ocean, pretty soon it got to England, and pretty soon it got to France, and people began to suddenly change their way of thinking.
As the Reformation gets to England, it coincides with King Henry VIII's break with the Pope and Rome. Henry is the one who gets all the credit for the English Reformation. He's just one little piece of it.
There are many others who are involved at the time, but it's a process. You know, none of this history happens in the blink of an eye. It all takes time.
Slowly, people began to put the Bible into the vernacular, whether it's into German, as Luther did, or whether it's into English, as Tyndale did. Some people think that is absolute heresy, that Scripture has to stay in the original Latin, or from my perspective, the Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. Priests and a few laymen could read and understand these languages, but there were people who really felt that ordinary people, illiterate or barely literate in English, would come to personally understand the Word of God better if it was in their own language.
So slowly things begin to change. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And when someone has all the power, everybody else on the bottom, you know, kind of gets crushed. So it took a long time for people who had a different way of thinking or who had an inspired notion to make everything accessible to everybody to succeed at all. When some people put the Bible into English, they get hung or drawn and quartered or burned at the stake. Just a little bit down the road, a king can do it, and it's just fine. So the Reformation, like all of this, is a process. And as England goes through a Reformation, of course, Germany and Switzerland and France, everybody is affected.
When it gets to England, because we are an English colony, that's our main concern here. So Henry VIII makes himself, not the Pope, head of the church in England, and other changes.
Only a king can take everything which was English Catholic and say, okay, move over here, now you're English Protestant. You're not going to pay the Pope, you're going to pay me. You're not going to obey the Pope, you're going to obey me. He was a devout Catholic in his head, and I should clarify a little bit there. Catholic means universal. We are children of one God. If you put a word in front of it, an adjective which modifies it, which says Roman, Byzantine, Coptic, Polish, you're then making it a denomination. So if you look at our neighbors who are Roman Catholics or Byzantine Catholics, that's a denomination in this country. But in the historical perspective, the word Catholic simply means universal. We are all children of one God. So Henry VIII stays Roman Catholic in his heart. And there are people who say he heard as many as 5 masses every single day, except when he was too busy hunting or riding or meeting new people, especially new ladies. But he actually manages to listen to his people which many monarchs and other heads of state don't always do. He realized that a lot of his people wanted to go a different way. So within England, there were people who wanted to purify. Now, as Americans, we have this awful myth that all America started in 1620 and the Mayflower was the only ship that did anything. And you should know it was just one of many ships that came. And of course, there were people in Florida and what we now call Canada way early. The English don't actually get here till 1607 in Virginia, although they get to Roanoke Island a little bit earlier. But Plymouth Rock and the Mayflower group is another whole story, but that's down the road. The people that get here are coming from England. They're stepping off of an Elizabethan stage. Well, part of that stage is shadowed by the Reformation.
Henry VIII's daughter, Elizabeth, is going to be the head of the Church of England. In her heart, I almost think she was still a very devout Roman Catholic, but she's going to allow her people a middle way, or via media, which, with her bishops, makes the church broad enough to accommodate all but the most conservative Catholics still loyal to Rome, and all but the most radical Puritans who want to purge or purify the English church of anything that smacks of Rome.
The middle way, or what we call the via media, is a much safer and much more sensible place to be. So Elizabeth allows her people some of that choice. There's a name which will haunt England for hundreds of years, and that name is Cromwell. And there was a Cromwell in the beginning of all the Reformation, and there was a Cromwell that comes along with the Puritans, who, again, is a huge name. And we don't have him here in Virginia, but we all endure the results of what he did. He was determined that the royalists be overturned and that everybody be a Puritan. And so he's the one ultimately responsible for the beheading of Charles I. Then we have a Puritan time period where everything which was high church is gone, stained glass is gone, gold is gone, anything which looks like Rome is gone, and everything has been purified. It's an interesting word. We all seem to be wanting things to be more pure, and even today, the church is in Reformation, not just the Episcopal Church, but the church is in Reformation. And if you speak with any of the leaders, we still seem to be wanting to purify, to get back to the original focus and the original reasons that we're here. The Puritans, who are all over England, are a very radical group. So they're sort of over here on the fringe. The English church, the Anglican church, is smack in the middle. But when Elizabeth is offering her people a choice, she is being very open, and she's actually listening, which is a good thing for a ruler to do. The people who sail for her and the people who sailed for her father are all kinds of people, and they get charters. Charters are a big part of our history. Sir Walter Raleigh got one to set out the Roanoke Island experiment, what we now call Nag's Head. That's in the 1580s. And that's a tumultuous time in England.
Elizabeth fears the Spanish and the French as Protestant England's Catholic enemy states. She fears the Vatican. She has the same kind of issues with the Vatican that her father had. She's afraid that she may lose control if the Vatican regains control.
I realize this is not politically correct, but history is what it is, or what it was, and it doesn't always fit our little boundaries. So forgive me if that is a problem. But when the defeat of the Armada occurs in 1588, the English are convinced that it was God's breath, that great ruach that came across the water and stopped the fleet. They're convinced that it was God's doing, that the Vatican could not take over England. So Elizabeth is convinced that she's on the right track, because obviously God did this for her. Many people in those days believed that every single thing that happened was God's action. So if you saw a comet go across the sky, that was an evil sign, because God sent that comet to warn you. You could be born under a bad star, and that was too bad for you, because God let you be born under a bad star. So they reacted to everything as if it immediately came from the hand of God.
In 1588, when the Spanish Armada is defeated, things begin to change a little bit.
Now, you know, government processes grind very slowly, and it takes a long time. They don't get to the treaty table till 1603. When they get to the treaty table, it's safe for the English to come back out on the water. Well, some of them have been sneaking around, making sure there's not too many Spanish pirates out there. So in the 1580s, Sir Walter Raleigh gets a charter for what we call Roanoke Island. And that's where there was an Elizabethan attempt at settlement. Charters are like birth certificates. They're the reasons you can go do something, and they give you the permission to go do it.
Sir Walter Raleigh's charter is quite a long piece of vellum.
It goes on at great length, telling from every generation, all of his assignees and every one of his heirs are all bound by this charter. So when they come over in those years, the Armada hasn't quite happened, but pretty soon it's going to happen. And when they go home for supplies, Elizabeth has closed the ports and said no one can come back out on the water. So they can't get back to check on the people they've left behind. When they do get back, after the Armada is defeated, then there is nothing left but the word Croatan carved into a tree. And it's as if spaceships came down and just picked everybody up and went away. No evidence of burning, no lots of bones, no burials, no sign of anything. It was just they were gone. So after the treaty is signed in 1603, then the English can come out on the water. So a number of people get together to try to plan for the next expeditions. And there are famous names. Bartholomew Gosnold is one of those, along with other people who are close to the crown and who were in a position to make the king listen. Well, by this point, Elizabeth is gone. James VI of Scotland has become James I of England, raised by the Calvinists, so he's got kind of a hard head, an incredibly intellectual man, very interesting and very colorful character. But he becomes high church later on in his life, but at this point he's still pretty much controlled by the Calvinists. And there's going to be a Calvinist strain or thread through all of this history that we talk about. These are people who are pretty clear about what they believe. And even when they hang the Ten Commandments in the church, they're split along a Calvinist line. 5 on this side have to do with our relationship with God. 5 on this side have to do with our relationship with each other. Everything is absolutely crystal clear to them. There are no shades of gray. So they're not very forgiving people. They're very hard-headed. But when King James is involved with running England, he has all this Calvinist background, but he also is very sensitive, intellectual, and takes to the high church part very easily. And we should probably say a word about what that means. High church and low church are ways that we kind of put somebody in a box and say this is what they are. And as much as I don't like that intellectually, it's an easy way to see that if you're high church, there's incense and bells and stained glass and everything that looks and sounds like Rome. If you're low church, there's none of that. And even today in the Episcopal Church, we have everything from the very, very charismatic speaking in tongues all the way over here to the Anglo-Catholic, which is very, very high. Well, Elizabeth would have had all of that in her experience as well. So Elizabeth and James, they have an opportunity not only to listen to their people, but they have a challenge in what their actions are going to produce. Because when a king or a queen does something, it's pretty permanent. And so they have to weigh all the sides before they make a decision. James had a hard time with the Puritans. Now, these are not exactly the same kind of Puritans that end up in Massachusetts, but they're similar. They're not exactly like the Puritans that end up in Virginia, but they're similar. And they didn't want any bishops. They didn't want any church hierarchy. They didn't want anyone that was going to control them or tell them what to do. And James's reaction is, well, no bishop, no king. So the king made the decisions, and he made himself very much aware of everything that was going on. So by 1607, the English are ready to make a real statement in the New World. They leave England in December of 1606. That morning or that week, they could have gone to a church all over England and found everything from a Puritan meeting house to a strict Calvinist room where all you did was read the Bible, to a high church service with incense and bells, to a church which was a sort of a command performance set up for the Virginia Company so that they all went to church before they got on the boats. One of the services was held where many of the people who got on the boats actually did go to a specific service, and the man who preached was the Reverend Mr. Croshaw, and he preached from Psalm 107.
They that go down to the sea in ships will yet see the wonders of the deep.
And their point was they would finance all of this exploration with a great seagoing venture, which would at one point then finance a great missionary venture. We do them great disservice if we say they only came for one thing. They didn't come just for God. They didn't come just for gold. They didn't come just for glory. They came for all those things. And underneath all that, they came to keep other people away. It's a wonderful thing to take maps of the New World and look at them through their eyes. A map of what we call the United States of America. A French map is going to call us New France. A Spanish map is going to call us New Spain, and an English map is going to correctly call us the continent of Virginia.
If you look at early colonial charters,
look at what they said they were going to do and where they were going to go. It goes from roughly South Carolina to Newfoundland, and from the Atlantic to the next sea, any land not governed by a Christian prince. So if there's already a Christian prince in control, don't go there. But that left the continent of Virginia, because the French Catholics are up here, the Spanish Catholics are down here, and the continent of Virginia is in the middle. They drew a line about halfway across, about 90 miles north of here, from here to the west coast. This piece is southern Virginia, that part was northern Virginia. The southern Virginia part happens in 1607. The northern Virginia folks don't get here till 1620.
the Church of England is what the Puritans who settled in New England were running away from.
And they are the very familiar Pilgrims and the very familiar Puritans. They go to Holland and they hang out in Leiden for a while till they realize they're losing their young people to the Dutch ways and to the Dutch language. And then with money lent to them by some very prominent Church of England folks, they are able to rent the Mayflower and come across the ocean. Well, they get here in 1620, and of course that's where a lot of our American history books begin. But they are coming for many reasons, and of course they have, because of many of our history books, become famous for wanting religious freedom.
Wanting religious freedom from the Church of England for themselves, yet they were very intolerant of religious views that differed from their own.
Southern Virginia was a more tolerant place We were happy churchmen here. They loved life and they believed God was in all of life, but they are mildly tolerant of dissenters. They don't necessarily burn them or hang them, as happened in other places. So Virginia was a little bit more tolerant place to be. So when those 3 ships get here in that beautiful spring, they sail up the bay. They stop at what is now Virginia Beach. They called it Cape Henry, which was the son of King James I. They named it Cape Henry, and they claimed the continent, and they planted across. They interacted with the natives for just a little bit. That didn't go real well. They found strawberries as big as a man's fist and oysters and clams probably 16 inches across, clear blue water, and I'm sure after all those months on the boat they thought they'd found paradise. Then they come on upriver to what we call Jamestown Island. They dropped anchor in 6 fathoms of water and began to unload the boats.
They built a fort, now known as Jamestown Fort,
which we have recently found all the evidence of. And so they begin the American experiment on that little salty island. One of the first things they did was have a service of Holy Communion, giving thanks for a safe voyage. Good Master Hunt, who had come on the ships with the men, was a Church of England clergyman who had been selected by the Bishop of London and the Archbishop of Canterbury as being the right person to bring the message of God to the New World. He was a peacemaker, and it's a good thing, because all those men on those ships all those months were not real happy, and they were needing a peacemaker among them, and Master Hunt seemed to be the right one. So they had their service of Holy Communion, and they had already begun the fort. They already had begun exploring to see what kind of a place they had discovered. The Jamestown story is full of excitement. It's full of exploration. It's full of finding out what the indigenous people were like who were all around us. It was their home first. They had been here for 12,000 years. It's about survival. It's about goals. Sometime very quickly it becomes about tobacco, from which Virginia becomes rich. The 17th century was a trying time for many people. For every 4 who got off a ship, 3 of them were dead within 6 months. So there was a lot of death at Jamestown. The place burned to the ground several times. And many people came hoping for a better life than what they had left in the old world. One description says that our sweet Jamestown had 30 taverns and 8 breweries. So it was a party place quite a bit. And there were often, one description says, never less than 100 sail on the river. So that means lots of sailors. And lots of sailors means lots of taverns. I think you probably could have heard a lot of different languages in those taverns if you were trying to get through Jamestown at that point. Clergy came, and they did the best they could with what they had, given that they're on the edge of a wilderness, given that the fear of Spanish pirates is right behind them. There was a Spanish spy who got to Jamestown. They kept him in jail for a long time so that he wouldn't get away. One of the wonderful maps we have of Jamestown was made by one of the spies. And so there's always that fear that Spain is going to be right behind you to take it away and make this New Spain instead of New England. The churches at Jamestown were all standard Anglican style with a long nave, and they were Gothic in structure. They had windows on the side and a great east window, and of course the 10 Commandments, which by canon law had to be hung in every church. They were careful with their communion wine. Early on, they guarded it. Even when they got to the starving time, they made sure they saved communion wine. So being connected to the traditions of home was a vital piece of their story. And you think about those men, and eventually the women who do get here, being so far from home, and the one thing that they could hold on to was church every Sunday. The words were the same, the Psalms were the same, the sermons were probably a little different, but they at least could hold on to a piece of home because they had church.